We continue our special coverage marking 1 year of Israel's genocide in Gaza. The past 12 months have galvanised millions of people across the world to take a stand and demand a ceasefire. In the first month of the war, 4,200 protests were recorded globally. The majority of them, more than 3,700, were against Israel's war. At least 520 were in support of Israel. Some of the largest demonstrations in solidarity with Palestinians and in condemnation of Israel's military assault on Gaza were held in the US, the UK and Yemen. Now, the war's impact on public opinion has been significant and in some places has even led to a shift in support for Israel. Alan Fisher begins our special coverage from Washington.
Free, free Palestine! Free!
It was as large as it was loud. A historic crowd on the streets of America's capital, the largest pro-Palestinian protest seen in Washington, D.C. It came just after October the 7th last year and the war in Gaza that followed.
End the genocide! End the war crimes!
But there was more, much more.
Palestine will be free!
In places north and south, east and west, from Texas to Boston.
Boston, you will see! Palestine will be free!
It was an expression of anger, of concern, of a movement creating movement.
The transformation of public opinion through protests and disruptions and political expression is unprecedented.
No justice, no peace!
There have been pro-Palestinian protests before, but nothing this big or significant.
We're part of generations of people that have taken on this fight, and you know, it's important that we don't lose that in sight of whatever may be happening on campus or in the region, that this is something that, you know, we're in it for the liberation of Palestine, and that's what's driving us forward.
The protests came in the most likely and unlikely places, at the two main political conventions in the summer, on Capitol Hill, when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed Congress, and at cultural gatherings and awards events like the Oscars.
Hard-won fundamental freedoms.
And they have challenged the politicians.
Everyone has a right and should have their voices heard.
Hey folks.
Just days ago, Joe Biden expressed his support for Israel. Even now,
No administration has helped Israel more than I have. None. None. None.
But there is a warning to politicians that traditional American attitudes are being challenged from the streets, and that has a long-term impact for US relations with Israel.
People understand more and more how this is not acceptable, how genocide, whoever wields it, it doesn't make it okay, it doesn't make it acceptable.
The war in Gaza has already impacted the US presidential election, and the result may have impacts in Gaza. But for the moment, the protests continue and people continue to die. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, students across the US have been particularly vocal, demanding their university and colleges cut economic ties with Israeli companies. They say the investments pay for Israeli crimes in Gaza. Laura Khan has more.
Students in the US began setting up encampments in university campuses in April, starting in New York. Some of those schools are elite and expensive to attend. Their demand? To divest from hedge funds that invest in companies that have contracts with Israel. Students at Columbia University took direct action, occupying the academic building Hamilton Hall and renaming it Hinds Hall. That's after a 6-year-old Palestinian girl who was killed by Israeli forces earlier in the year. It inspired two popular songs by artist Macklemore.
The people out here united, never be defeated when freedom's on the horizon.
Dozens were arrested as police moved in. University President Minouche Shafik resigned months later after facing scrutiny for her handling of the protests. Many other universities called in the police, which took swift action, moving in on campuses across the US and arresting more than 3,000 protesters. Students were also threatened with dismissal, police charges or missing graduation, leaving many uncertain about their futures. But the protests left their mark. Several universities agreed to reconsider investments into Israeli companies, including Northwestern, Brown, Rutgers, Johns Hopkins, the University of Minnesota, and the University of California, Riverside.
Ceasefire now!
Well, students who took part in the protest movement in the US have been marking 1 year of Israel's war with more demonstrations. A federal judge stopped an attempt to ban a vigil by a Palestinian student group at the University of Maryland. But as Kristen Salumi reports, the new restrictions at other colleges are forcing student activists to change their tactics.
Art as Protest. Nadine Fatala organized this exhibit at New York University, featuring submissions from activists who, like her, took part in demonstrations on college campuses last spring.
This was really like my attempt to create a record of the movement, to represent it on its own terms.
As of this semester, new restrictions on where students can gather and what they can say are forcing them to get creative.
The university has literally cordoned off every single space of gathering that is on its university campus, all to suppress the word Palestine. And so we understand that, and we're just looking for new tactics to sort of mobilize and continue the movement going.
Last semester, over 130 demonstrators, including students and faculty, were arrested after setting up an encampment in the school's main plaza and demanding an end to investments in Israel. A second encampment at a different location was also shut down.
The students started an encampment here, which was just small tents.
Sinan Antoun is a professor who was arrested. While most criminal charges were dropped, some faculty were fired and several students suspended.
So it's an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. And frankly, with this new student conduct policy, anyone who teaches anything on settler colonialism or Zionism or Israel or the history of Palestine has to think twice about how they teach.
This here is the plaza where the initial encampment was set up. You can see such an encampment wouldn't be possible now because of the walls that have been put in place and the security measures. The university says it respects students' right to protest, but now the guidelines in place for doing so are among the strictest in the nation.
Some legal experts argue the rules stifle free speech, not hate.
What we're seeing is that pro-Israel lobby groups are trying to disingenuously redefine anti-Semitism to include support for Palestinian rights or criticism of Israel. And, Zionism is a political ideology, and political ideologies are not protected classes under the Constitution.
Free Palestine!
Despite the restrictions, students continue to find ways to advocate for Palestine, joining with other schools and community organizations in public spaces as well as on campus to make their voices heard. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
Danny Shaw is a former professor at John Jay College who says his vocal opposition to Israel's war on Gaza cost him his job. He earlier spoke to my colleague Rob Matheson about his ordeal.
I was fired the week of Easter for my outspokenness, and not even in the classroom, but in the streets of New York City and across this country, where the American people every day are waking up more and more to Israeli and Western genocidal crimes against the Palestinian people, against the Lebanese people, the Syrian people. And because we dare to call out Zionism for what it is, they have come after us. I was fired. I was doxxed. They censored my Twitter and other social media. And then the FBI as well detained me and interrogated me for the crime of speaking up about peace.
What was it that they actually alleged you had done? Because obviously there is no crime for speaking about peace, but they must have tried to justify your detention in some way.
Yeah, well, Rob, what they try to do, what they've been doing for 76 long colonial genocidal years, is they are conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which is absolutely ridiculous when so many of our Jewish sisters and brothers from Jewish Voice for Peace and so many other groups are on the front lines here in New York City and across the country trying to stop this genocide and questioning why the government of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have sent upwards towards almost $100 billion to support this ongoing genocide just in the past year, never mind the somehow $400 billion that they've sent since 1948.
How has this impacted on your life? Talk to us about how it's affected your daily life, for example.
Well, once you get doxxed, they put you up on all types of websites. So when people Google the name Danny Shaw, I come up as someone who's anti-Semite. This is used ingenuously. This is what Dr. Norman Finkelstein calls the weaponization or the misuse of anti-Semitism. It's extremely cynical that they would conflate people who speak up for peace and human rights and against the squandering of how many hundreds of billions of dollars on war and genocide when the American people need that money right here for hurricane relief, to invest in our education. It's very intimidating. I think what it means, too, is a certain social isolation or social death, because a lot of my colleagues, I think very shamefully, were afraid to stand shoulder to shoulder with me.
Well, students in Europe joined the protests as well, demanding their universities and colleges cut ties with Israel. Within 1 month, students set up camps and occupied halls on campuses in several countries. Felia Card takes a look.
University encampments in the US inspired a movement across Europe. Students occupied university grounds and halls in Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, France and the UK, among others, all demanding an end to economic partnerships that would profit from Israel's war on Gaza. In Berlin, students set up tents and formed a human chain around them. At Berlin Free University's request, police arrived and dragged off students. In early May, Dutch police destroyed a student encampment at the University of Amsterdam after students refused to leave. Police charged towards protesters, injuring many and arresting more than 120. A week later, staff and students across the Netherlands rallied against the war on Gaza. In France, students at the Sciences Po protested outside their college, calling for more global attention on Israeli attacks. And students dug into lawns of British universities, including Oxford, Cambridge and King's College London. Many institutions took a hard line against the protesters, but they also made an impact. Among them, a Belgian university severed ties with Israeli institutions. A Finnish university cancelled an Israeli exchange programme. And the UK's Reading University agreed to cut financial ties with Barclays Bank, which has contracts linked with Israel. While 76 universities across Spain cut ties with Israeli universities and research centres.
Well, a string of solidarity marches took place throughout Europe in support of the Palestinians, even when bans were imposed to prevent them, with cities like London seeing massive turnouts week after week. Sonia Gallego has more on that.
A year of demonstrations in a time of upheaval. During the turmoil of war, a mass movement has swept across the European continent. From Berlin to Brussels to Barcelona, people have gathered to oppose Israel's war on Gaza. Even defying bans, as Italy's government attempted to impose, provoking anger and violence between police and protesters. In the UK, the marches have become the largest protest movement seen in recent years, with thousands from all walks of life taking part, moved by the seemingly endless scenes of death and destruction. Colleagues of those killed while working to save lives in Gaza under deteriorating conditions. Their voices an essential insight into the immense challenges faced by healthcare workers there.
What we're seeing is a deliberate attack on the healthcare infrastructures across Palestine and now in Lebanon. And it's just devastating because we had worked to strengthen the healthcare system and to build certain programs so that Palestinians had the right to access quality healthcare that was equitable.
With no end to the destruction, many fear that the West's seeming inability to enable a ceasefire is fueling the war.
A year on, and as the war continues and has even crossed borders, there is a definitive sense of frustration here at these demonstrations that not nearly enough is being done by the British government in order to bring about a cessation of hostilities as well as peace negotiations.
Stephen Kaposh, a Jewish Holocaust survivor, has regularly attended these rallies. Together with his family and other survivors' relatives, he protests against what he says Israel is doing to justify its war on Gaza.
I had to wear the yellow star even though I was 7 years old. And it just sickened me to see this misuse of the memory of the Holocaust.
1 year on, and as the seemingly endless cycle of terror and pain continues in Gaza and beyond, the message from the streets to those caught in the conflict: they are not forgotten. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, London.
Showing solidarity with people in Gaza has become risky in Germany. Artists, writers, street protests have been cancelled, silenced or arrested. Some even lost their jobs after expressing anger against Israel's genocide in Gaza. It's part of what Germany sees as its historical responsibility to support Israel unconditionally. Sepp Vassen spoke to a young boy who was chased by police at a protest.
11-year-old Ali chased by German police officers in late September while carrying a Palestinian flag. These images causing outrage worldwide.
First there were 3 and then around 15 policemen standing around me. I was really afraid. I know from TikTok how they like to beat people and there were so many. I thought they were going to hit me.
Police later explained they took him because he was an unaccompanied minor. But Ali says he attended the rally with his uncle because he wanted to express his anger over Israel's killing of children in Gaza. Ali's father is a Palestinian refugee who came to Germany 35 years ago and says the incident has traumatized his son.
I fled from war after my grandfather was murdered. My father chose to live in a free country, but when I see what's happening, I believe this has nothing to do with democracy, nothing.
The boy's arrest came after a year of nearly weekly protests in Germany, leading to hundreds of arrests. Initially, demonstrations in solidarity with Gaza were banned, but after public outrage they were allowed under strict rules, including banning certain slogans, such as "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." German authorities consider this to be anti-Semitic. Despite the ban, courts have sometimes ruled against it, with some people who use the slogan finding themselves acquitted.
Germany's broad definition of anti-Semitism does not only include hatred against Jews, but also attacks against Israel, such as expressed verbally or in signs. Some say this has given the authorities an excuse to criminalize certain people and certain groups and violate their freedom of speech.
Iris Hafetz left Israel 22 years ago. Despite being arrested 3 times, she continues to call on Germany to stop its support for Benjamin Netanyahu's government. She says Germany claiming historic guilt towards Jews is hypocritical.
If you have guilt and you feel responsibility, why only to these Jews in Israel who are right-wing Jews? What about other Jews? Why you're not feeling guilty for them? I mean, what we see now is that Israel is not only committing genocide, Israel is also committing suicide.
The activist was carrying a sign reading "Stop the Genocide" when she was first arrested.
It's scary when you see policemen who are well educated in Germany and they know exactly the law and they tell me as a Jew, we just follow our orders. Yeah?
Government statistics show that anti-Semitic incidents in Germany almost doubled last year. In the same period, hate crimes against Muslims increased more than 100%. Despite his arrest, Ali says he'll continue to protest.
I feel bad because our family is dying there.
With around 40,000 people of Palestinian origin in Berlin, the capital will continue to be the stage of anti-war protests, despite the actions of police. Sepp Vassen, Al Jazeera, Berlin.
Well, France has large Jewish and Muslim populations. 1 year after October the 7th, the authorities there are increasingly concerned about the divisions that Israel's war on Gaza is creating in society. Natasha Butler reports from Paris.
A dispute erupted between France and Israel earlier this week after the French president said countries should stop sending weapons to Israel, comments the Israeli Prime Minister called shameful.
Nous essayons aussi d'être cohérents.
We try to be consistent, and when we ask for ceasefires, as we've done for Gaza and Lebanon, we try not to ask for a ceasefire while continuing to deliver weapons of war.
Pas demander un cessez-le-feu tout en continuant à livrer les armes de la guerre.
In a bid to calm tensions, Emmanuel Macron later told Benjamin Netanyahu that France was committed to Israel's security. The past year has been a balancing act for Macron, particularly because France is home to the biggest Jewish and Muslim communities in Europe, and officials are concerned both about rising Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
Pour essayer de comprendre, c'est quoi être juif en France?
Juliette is worried about the growing divisions in France. She's produced a podcast about how young Jewish people like her, who regard themselves as liberal, have experienced the past 12 months. She says there's been a mixture of hostility and lack of empathy.
It feels like a wall has been built, even though we are so far away in France, in a peaceful country, in a place where we should be able to talk to each other and listen to each other.
Rima Hassan is also striving to be heard. She's become a symbol of the Palestinian cause in France. Born in a refugee camp in Syria, the French-Palestinian lawyer was elected as a left-wing member of the European Parliament in June. She says the EU and France have let down Palestinians.
C'est une année terrible.
It's been a terrible year. I feel like my body's been split in two because I'm French and Palestinian. But it felt like France was participating in the massacre of Palestinians, like a father killing a mother. France needs to be consistent when it says it defends human rights.
Macron says Lebanon cannot become another Gaza, and he says a political solution is urgent. Meanwhile, on the streets, the demonstrations continue, and so do the commemorations, as the past weighs heavily on two communities in France who both fear what the future may bring. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Still ahead in our special coverage of Israel's genocide in Gaza.
I'm Lucia Newman in Santiago, Chile, one of the many Latin American countries that are protesting Israel's war on Gaza.
The world is witnessing Israel's war on Gaza unfold, but the atrocities taking place on the ground have put Palestinians and their rights back in the spotlight, prompting some significant diplomatic shifts. In May, Norway, Ireland and Spain recognised Palestine as an independent state based on the pre-1967 borders, with occupied East Jerusalem as its capital. A few days later, Slovenia followed suit, all part of a wider effort by some European countries to put pressure on Israel to end its war. Al Jazeera's Willem Marks reports from Dublin.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
All this year, marchers across Ireland's cities and towns have continued to call for an end to violence and occupation.
Palestine! Free! Free! Palestine! Free! Free! Palestine! Occupation no more!
At a recent protest picket in downtown Dublin, there's no shouting, just the sound of supportive car horns.
Polls this past year have found large majorities of people in Ireland support Palestinian self-determination, believe that Palestinians live under a form of apartheid rule in Israel, and consider Israeli attacks on Gaza to be unjustified.
Every week for 11 months, these Irish citizens have sought a ceasefire in Gaza and now Lebanon. Among them is Kieran Perry, a member of Dublin City Council, who helps organise this demonstration each Thursday. He says the Irish have sometimes felt helpless to intervene.
They would have assumed with the huge marches that were on the public display of support that it would have forced the US and the government and the other EU governments to stop the Israelis doing what they're doing, and it hasn't. And I believe feel now that they actually have no power.
In refugee camps.
But back in May, the Irish government did intervene significantly.
We here in Ireland, we see you, we recognise you, we respect you, and today Ireland formally recognises the state of Palestine.
Ireland's Prime Minister Simon Harris said this recognition reflected his nation's own experience of occupation under British rule.
Taking our place on the world stage and being recognised by others as having the right to be there was a matter of the highest importance for the founders of our state.
After months of misery in Gaza, that day in May was a rare cause for celebration amongst Palestinians and their supporters. with similar simultaneous announcements in Spain,
official recognition of Palestine as a state,
and Norway.
Og I forhold til støtte til Palestina.
For Palestine's top diplomat in Ireland, it was a happy day.
That gives me a very kind of pride, and I feel that all the time, feel that the Palestinian people deserve this, and we need to work even harder for other European countries and the whole world to recognize the state of Palestine.
Not merely just a symbol, Ireland's recognition actually carved out a practical pathway to long-term peace.
That gives the Palestinians at least some kind of horizon for a political solution to this plight that is going for more than 7 decades.
Irish independence came only after centuries of colonialism. Across the generations in present-day Ireland, the hope now is that Palestine's own future will arrive far sooner. Willem Marks, Al Jazeera, Dublin.
Bobby McDonough is a former Irish ambassador to the UK, EU and Italy. He explains why Ireland's decision to recognise Palestine as an independent state was crucial.
I think what's happening to the Palestinian people is a tragedy. And therefore, in a sense, we have all failed. But that doesn't mean that the steps that have been taken are not helping to make some sort of progress on the issue. And Ireland's decision to recognise Palestine in May had the overwhelming support of the Irish people. So it doesn't stop the Israeli assaults on civilians in Gaza, but it does provide some sort of moral support for the Palestinian people. The Irish approach to this has always tried to be a balanced one. We believe in the right of Israel to live in security, but we believe in the equal right of the Palestinians to their own state. And I emphasize the word equal because they may not be as strong militarily or backed by a superpower, but morally they have an equal right to a state. And the Irish decision last May to recognize Palestine was the right one at the time. And it's becoming ever more evident that it was the right decision as we see the Netanyahu's government's attempts to make it impossible for the Palestinians ever to exercise their right to a full state.
And as we heard in our earlier report, along with Ireland, Norway and Spain recognised a Palestinian state on the same day in May. The Norwegian Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide told Al Jazeera his government is working to help Palestine prepare for full statehood.
We are working on is also what happens when a ceasefire is in place, because a ceasefire is urgently needed, it's an imperative, but it's not in itself a solution, it's just end the violence. So what we need to do, and what we are working now with a group of Arab, OIC and European countries, and in an ever larger group, is to start planning for how do we accelerate the work of establishing a Palestinian state, one Palestine, a Palestine that encompasses both the West Bank and Gaza under one leadership. And that work is extremely important, even if it is not implemented tomorrow. It's important that more and more countries sign up to this. And you should note that despite of the ongoing conflict, the number of countries that are saying clearly and loudly that there is no other outcome of this than finally to get to a Palestinian state, that again can be part of a two-state solution. That coalition of countries is growing by the day. And I think that's really worthwhile, even if I deplore, like you, the continued ongoing violence. Israel is finding itself increasingly isolated. Of course, we respect the need for Israeli security, but we believe that Israel will be more secure and the people of Israel will be more secure if the political problem that is the core, at the core of all these conflicts is finally solved.
Well, while Spain, Norway, Ireland and Slovenia have been the most recent countries to recognise the state of Palestine, they're not alone, but rather part of a larger global group. Take a look here. 147 of the 193 member states of the United Nations already recognise Palestine. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, Maran Bashara. He joins us from London. Maran, first of all, what do you make of the fact that since October the 7th last year, the Palestinian cause has received increasing recognition around the world, and yet the war on Gaza continues and intensifies?
Yes, this is the most bitter paradox of it all. this is what we call negative correlation between what's happening to Palestine, the homeland, and what's happening to Palestine, the cause for justice. So while the cause for justice for Palestine is gaining momentum around the world, recognition, support, solidarity, activism, and so on and so forth, Palestine is suffering more than ever before as genocides continues to unravel. We would have hoped that with the continuation of the solidarity, the activism, and the support around the world, that this will start making a dent in Palestine. To my mind, it should have, and it will eventually. The only reason it hasn't yet is because of the blind, foolish, reckless, short-sighted American/British, French, German support to Israel and the worst of Israeli governments as they carry their genocide.
Marwan, as we just said, 147 of the 193 member states of the United Nations already recognise Palestine as a state. But what does that mean practically speaking? Is there a diplomatic solution to Palestine receiving full statehood?
Well, look, there's absolutely no way out of the ongoing debacle, ongoing horrific scenes in Palestine other than an eventual recognition of the Palestinians' right to self-determination, of independence, of freedom, of justice, just the basic rights that any people around the world deserve and must have, just like the Israelis have and other people around the region have. You know, when the partition plan took place back in 1947, there were only 50-plus countries around the world. Today, as you said, there's 190-plus countries, and Palestine is yet to be recognized. So it certainly merits the recognition, and certainly so many more countries now are recognizing Palestine. Eventually, America will have to give in, because the only obstacle, once again, at the UN Security Council is America. If America recognizes Palestine, England and France and others with the veto will recognize Palestine. The question is, why isn't America recognizing Palestine while always insisting that it supports the two-state solution, meaning Israel and Palestine? The rationale is really is comical, right? Because they've been at it for 30 years. And presumably the objective, the aim of the negotiations, the peace process, is eventually a two-state solution. So why don't we, end the mystery, recognize Palestine, and work towards that in the negotiation? Because that certainly will give the Palestinians the confidence that at least a diplomatic process will give them something tangible in return. After Palestine is recognized, a good number of arrangements could be done between the river and the sea, where two people can be free, where it could be federation, confederation, one state, two states, whatever it is.
Marwan Bashara joining us there from London. Many thanks indeed. Well, to Latin America now, where a vast majority of countries have been staunch critics of Israel. Protests in support of the Palestinian cause have continued for a year. Lucia Newman reports from Chile, home to one of the largest Palestinian diaspora communities.
One by one, they read out the names of the more than 16,000 child victims of Israel's war on Gaza, starting with babies less than a year old. Chile is home to the largest and most influential Palestinian community outside of the Middle East.
Palestine has become the last frontier for morality and international law. If the US and its allies are willing to keep supporting Israel at any cost, then there is no reason to keep believing in a world that respects the rule of law.
This vigil is taking place in front of Chile's presidential palace, although its occupant needs no convincing. On October 7th last year, President Gabriel Boric denounced Hamas's attack on Israel as an act of terrorism. But ever since, he has been describing Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, as a, quote, criminal, an assassin, and a perpetrator of genocide. And here in Latin America, Chile's president is far from alone. Neighboring Bolivia was the first to officially break diplomatic ties with Israel when the bombings against Gaza began. Chile, Colombia, and Honduras have recalled their ambassadors. Peru, Venezuela, Mexico, Cuba, Uruguay, and Brazil, among others, are also outspoken critics, demanding an immediate ceasefire.
Frankly, it's inexplicable that the UN Security Council does not have the moral and political authority to make Israel sit down at the table and talk instead of killing.
But there are those who remain staunch supporters of Netanyahu, with Argentina's President Javier Milei taking the lead. Ecuador and El Salvador are following suit, even while Salvador's President Nayib Bukele is of Palestinian origin. Still, most countries have remained engaged and outraged by the war on Gaza and say not enough is being done.
After 1 year, the world seems to be numb in the face of this horror. The global reaction should be much stronger.
Some say that Latin American countries have shown more courage and initiative to denounce the carnage in Gaza than many Arab countries. Yet, with the exception of Brazil, the region has limited power to impact the outcome. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago.
In January, the world's top court found Israel is plausibly perpetrating genocide in Gaza. The International Court of Justice issued several provisional measures compelling Israel to abide by the Genocide Convention. With the war entering its second year, Israel continues to defy the court rulings. Michael Apple reports.
3 months into the war in Gaza, South Africa leveled the gravest of accusations against Israel. It's committing genocide.
This killing is nothing short of destruction of Palestinian life. It is inflicted deliberately. No one is spared, not even newborn babies.
At the time the case opened at the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, in The Hague at the end of last year, the death toll in Gaza stood at over 21,000 Palestinians, a third of them children.
As we stand today, 1% of the Palestinian population in Gaza has been systematically decimated.
South Africa's lawyers argued that intentional genocide wasn't some fringe notion, but was being openly discussed by the leadership in Israel.
Israel's political leaders, military commanders, and persons holding official positions have systematically and in explicit terms declared their genocidal intent.
The actions of the Israeli forces seen as a reflection of the attitude of their leaders. Israel rejected the claim of genocide, saying it was Hamas who should be in the dock.
There is little beyond random assertions to demonstrate that Israel has or has had the specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the Palestinian people as such.
Israel also cast doubt on the actual number of casualties in Gaza, calling South Africa, quote, the legal arm of the Hamas terrorist organization.
As the applicant repeats, as many have, unverified statistics provided by Hamas itself, hardly a reliable source.
In late January, the court handed down a landmark judgment, issuing 6 binding provisional measures. Among them, that Israel immediately takes steps to prevent genocide and ensure the Strip receives life-saving humanitarian aid. When Israeli forces looked set to assault Gaza's southernmost city of Rafah, South Africa successfully applied to the court for an order to stop it. The ICJ's ruling was explicit. Israel must immediately halt the offensive on the city, where more than 1 million displaced Palestinians were sheltering. But Israel was defiant.
No power on earth will stop Israel from protecting its citizens and going after Hamas in Gaza.
The ICJ relies on the UN Security Council to enforce accountability, but critics say Israel has acted with impunity for decades.
It's imperative that the international community learn the lessons that ignoring international law when it comes to Israel and Palestine only begs the repetition of these awful events.
Human rights experts are warning that without the rulings of the ICJ being respected, The international rules-based order is on a knife's edge. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera.
Well, separate to the ICJ case, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, announced in May that he was applying for arrest warrants for top Israeli and Hamas leaders. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant are wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity in their war on Gaza. Khan also applied for warrants for Hamas's political and military leaders Ismail Haniyeh, Mohammed Deif and Yahya Sinwar. Those allegations stem from the October 7th attack that killed hundreds of Israeli civilians. Sinwar, Hamas's new leader, could be the only one of the three still alive after Israel claims to have killed Deif in Gaza in mid-July, but Hamas has never confirmed this. Israel also assassinated Haniyeh in the Iranian capital, Tehran, at the end of July. The ICC's pre-trial chamber is yet to approve the warrants. Lindiwe Zulu is a member of the National Executive Committee of South Africa's ANC party.
We do not need to be anywhere near a war, and especially in a place where there is genocide being created. Let us go back to South Africa's own struggle. The main people who supported the liberation struggle of South Africa were in each and every continent of the world. They were nowhere near what was happening in South Africa, but they took a firm decision because they understood and appreciated what the African National Congress was calling for freedom in South Africa, as well as the people of South Africa. So even in this case, we do not believe we need to be close to where the war is happening in order for us to raise our voices and call on the international community to join the progressive forces and demand for an end of the war, but first and foremost, an end through ceasefire and through discussion. So we do not need to be close to it. Everybody in the world can see it. Everyone in each and every corner, when they turn on their TVs, their radios, when they see people on the streets, like they saw us in South Africa in the past weekend, where we mobilized people to stand up in support of the Palestinian people and to call to an end to genocide.
A group of artists in London has been so moved by the work of Palestinian reporters during this conflict, including our own Hind Kudari, has created a series of murals to honour them.
My name's Callum Hall and I'm the founder of Creative Debuts. Creative Debuts is an art platform focused on the disruption and democratisation of the art world. The Heroes of Palestine murals in general have been very disruptive. Obviously we had the intention to have them as uncontroversial as possible. We thought painting doctors and journalists should be accepted and should be welcomed and celebrated in any country. You see these crazy numbers about the death, the destruction, the displaced, the disease outbreak, and what we wanted to do is center back on individuals, humanize what's happening. We wanted people to be able to go to individuals for sources of information, hence why we've painted journalists. They should be celebrated in every possible way. They are literally putting their lives on the line. They are documenting the genocide against all forces that are against them. We wanted to make sure we are depicting real life, but we also wanted to celebrate the defiance, the bravery, the inspiration that these characters have. What's been really important with the murals is collaborating with the kind individuals and people that have donated their walls. And obviously with the mural that we have here, it's our biggest, it's its most impactful, and none of it would be possible without Alia.
Without them, we wouldn't have a clue of what was actually happening. And I thought our community would really appreciate it. We want to show them support because it's so hard for them. They're not able to stay with their families, and we want to show them that they are actually our heroes. The response has been nothing but love, and I think the best response was when we had the kids from the local area seeing it for the first time, the excitement that they had, the smiles on their faces, it was priceless.
A lot of the people that we've painted have been thrown into this incredibly horrific, traumatic situation, and they are documenting it. So we fall in love with them, we are in this journey through them, and it's been they're just so brave and such an inspiration for all of us.